My name's Eric Geyer. I work for the Denver Botanic Gardens, Chatfield Farms location. Gosh, I've been here almost 9 years now, and my roles kind of changed. I grew up in the horticulture department, and eventually we kind of split that off into an arboriculture and natural areas program, and that's really home for me now. But happy to see a lot of friends and coworkers on this call. And really, thanks to Mason for putting this together. Mason was on a tour out here at some point this summer, and we were just chatting about the project, and they put this together for us. So thanks so much, Mason. And yeah, I'll go through a presentation here, and then I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. You can throw them in the chat, or we can do them live at the end. I'll kind of have Mason help me wrangle that one. But yeah, here we go. Hey everyone, like I said, my name is Eric Geyer. I have two roles at our site. I manage our natural areas and restoration projects, but also serve as one of our campus arborists as well. So in kind of a unique position where I get to, manage all aspects of my portions of our property here. So today we'll focus on prairie and riparian restoration and some of the work we've been doing over the years. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Chatfield Farms, but if you're not, we are the Southwest Metro. You can see where our mothership, DBG downtown, is. We're a little piece of paradise right along the foothills with some really wonderful natural features. If we zoom in a bit, you'll notice our property with that star on it there. We're really at a unique position, both for plants and wildlife. Um, if you can see my cursor, we're this natural transition from foothills, plant communities, really onto the high plains. And our plants reflect that. For example, our cottonwood species, we go from narrow leaf to hybridized plains and narrow leaf to acuminata. It's a cool space where we have all three naturally occurring, and you really get to see that transition. And so a lot of our restoration work really focuses on those plant communities. But equally as important is we're this really valuable wildlife corridor, and that's one of the big reasons I love working here is to help preserve and enhance that. You'll see on the north of us, we're really bound by Highway 470, and then along our eastern edge is Wadsworth. So we've got these really two big man-made features that are kind of natural barriers, and so this open space between us, Jefferson County, just upstream from us, and some of these ranches, they provide one of the most valuable wildlife corridors, and something I hope we'll preserve for a long time. And it's not just critters here day to day. We get a lot of migratory birds, especially on some of our ponds. I think for those in the know, they really enjoy spending time watching the diversity of birds that both make residence here, but also just come through migrating throughout the seasons. And also sometimes large mammals as well. Like this was a one of those odd September snowstorms where it pushed a herd of elk down from the high country, and they were out hanging in our property early in the morning. You can see Wadsworth in the background there. So it's a lively place, right? We need space, and that's one thing that we can provide. But we're also blessed with Deer Creek Natural Area on the lower end of our property towards the east. There's a really wonderful natural wetland where we've got some ponds, but we've also got a really dynamic stream system. And it keeps water year round down here. There's some springs, but also the work of our natural, ecosystem engineers. These water managers, the beavers, really, they do a great job at managing the landscape at a large level for us. And as an arborist, it's a tricky balance, right? I've got to make sure that I'm not allowing them to take everything and create hazards, but also at the same time, I think we have a responsibility to allow them to engage in their behavior. It's really critical for a lot of the other species that can then benefit from some of the shifts in the hydrology and landscape because of the work they do. They're kind of photogenic too. My wife wanted to put lipstick on them. I probably should have let her. Aren't they funny? I enjoy it. They're they're really, in a lot of ways, what we're mimicking, trying to do, but they do it kind of effortlessly. And that's what's so fun about my job is I get to manage these large expanses of natural areas, and that doesn't mean they're pristine native habitat. Sometimes we just need space, even if it's a mix of non-native and native habitat. But we also need, things like snagged box elder trees, like this picture on the left. Um, if we condemn trees that are hollow, especially in these natural areas, we miss out on a lot of really neat opportunities to host wildlife. And this was a surprise watching these little raccoons come out of that tree. Um, and often, to my surprise, they interact together. I set up these wildlife cameras at different parts of our property to really monitor their movement as water level changes, as streams flood, as structures get impacted. You know, it's important to know what's going on in a dynamic system. Excuse me. Um, but that's really the natural area side of our property, right? I still manage it to a degree, but it's not what I would call an area that we focus on restoring. It's more of an enhanced area. And so we're going to kind of flirt with what that middle ground looks like is taking some of these natural areas, really enhancing and restoring them, and trying to get as many native plants on the ground. And so that's what we're going to dive into today is my restoration. And for me, it's all about soil. It really, really starts there. When I first started doing restoration, it was all about, what are the plants I'm going to put on top of it? And I've become less focused on what those plants actually are and more focused on their community aspect and how they interact with the below ground ecosystems, really. And so this is what I'm thinking about at all these different phases in my restoration. How am I going to be impacting soil in the cleanup phase, in my site prep phase? When I'm seeding, am I using machines or am I doing it by hand? How are we managing soil moisture, debris management? Are we introducing disturbance? Even just getting an understanding of what your current and former site use are. Um, those are all really critical things. And so for me, that's really what sets the baseline for my restoration is having a good understanding of my soil, its properties, its capacity, and what I need to do to move forward. And so this will almost be an outline of what we go through today. For example, the sites that I'm really going to focus on, they're a deep sandy loam. Here at Chatfield Farms, it's an old cattle farm. So it's been heavily grazed, probably gotten weedy at certain points. It's been feed up. So knowing that history is important because your soil will reflect that. Is it aggregated or not? And we'll look at that a little bit later. What's my dominant cover? For me, it's smooth brome grass. And I know there's some folks on this call who are interested in smooth brome restoration. And so we'll focus on that today. But I really want people to get to think about not only soil as being something we just plant into, but really it's something we need to think about in every single phase of restoration work. I think if we can restore soil, it really creates more opportunity to restore the above ground. Excuse me one second. So for me, smooth brome. That's really what I'm starting with. When I moved to this area, not from here originally, grew up all over New Mexico. I kept hearing about smooth brome, and gosh, everyone is annoyed by smooth. Well, I finally got to start working with it, and the more I got to understand it, I really had to look at it from two sides. So on our property, smooth brome is now really invasive and it's really annoying. It's not the best way I can describe it. It is persistent, but those same attributes are what made it a really great forage grass. And so if you look at this description here, there's just a couple things I highlighted that are keys for me. It's a cool season grass. Okay, so we know what season it's going to be its healthiest and most actively growing. It's an aggressive sod former. Okay, so we know that's something in restoration we don't want to come back. This I find interesting. Growth of sod bound stands can sometimes be improved by tilling. Okay, so if tilling improves the growth of brome, that's certainly something I want to be mindful as I'm going forward with trying to remove the brome, and that plays a big role for me. And then it says it was quality livestock forage, and that really speaks to the land use history here. It was a homestead in the late 1860s or 1890s, and they grazed cattle. And so at some point, this grass was introduced, and it probably outcompeted a lot of even the wheat. And so it provided what it needs. But it makes it tricky to restore. But I've actually grown to appreciate that, and so I want to share that with you all today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here shortly. I use this test. It's called a slake test or an aggregate stability test. And really, what I'm doing is taking a dried clod of soil and I'm going to put it in a tube of water. And what we're trying to see is, can our soil handle the pressures of water rushing into that pore space? Does it hold its structure? Does the aggregate stabilize? Or does it flake off and collapse? And so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to slide over and see if I can do this quick demo for everybody. Okay. So I've got two different soil clods. These are the very exact same soil type. They come from 5 feet away of a fence line, okay? On one side of the fence, we have kind of a conventional agricultural field where we grow corn, pumpkins, but also a winter wheat cover crop in a 3-year rotation. And then just on the other side of that, there is soil from the fence line where the mowers miss. And so that soil has been under perennial cover, although it being smooth brome, just a single species, um, but it's had very different management. So I think it's interesting to see as I place these in the water, we'll kind of watch and see what happens and see if their aggregates are stable. And bear with me, this will take a few moments here. And I can try to speed this up a bit. But what you'll quickly see is the tube on this side versus the tube on that side is slowly starting to flake off. And so what that's telling me is that soil in a lot of ways has lost its structure. If it can't handle these quick, intense bursts of rain or moisture that we receive, that's essentially where we get runoff problems. And so being in the arid Southwest, we really want to capture every bit of moisture that we get, especially as they come in quickly through these storms. So can your soil handle infiltration quickly? And can it hold on to that moisture? And so soil structure within these aggregates are really the key to understanding that. I'll give these a little shake here for the sake of time so you can kind of see the differences. So there one goes. This one starts to flake off, whereas this one, even as I'm shaking it, the soil structure is retained. I'm all about simple in-field tests to give you an indication of your soil health or your soil function. And so today, we're really going to think about that is, although this was under brome grass, it built soil structure. And so for me, that's an advantage in restoration is if you have a soil that actually has structure, let's retain it and restore on top of it. And so that's going to be a big part of what I'm sharing with you all today. Let me see if I can go back to the presentation. Okay. And so if you get a chance, you can build these tubes at home. Seriously, they're pretty easy to do. You just need to drop some soil down in there and a little screen to hold it. And I encourage people to leave them even for overnight, and you'll see that one soil will retain and one won't if it is aggregated. So we'll explore a little bit on why aggregation is so important and how plants are the drivers for that soil aggregation. This is really my dumbed down version of plants' interactions with soil. And I think this is really led to a lot of my success in restoration. So we have the sunlight getting processed through green leaves of plants. As those plants process that through photosynthesis, it moves down into the root system, and some of that gets exuded through those roots. And at that point, there's this unique marriage between fungi, soil, and plant roots. And in a healthy environment, that is what's going to aid our plants in being more drought tolerant, being able to germinate, and really make that initial marriage with soil. So if there was a moment in restoration that I could key in on for all success, it's that right there. And we'll explore that. So aggregate stability. Rudy Garcia and Ray Archuleta, they're two guys that I'm really fond of. If you get a chance, look them up online. That's where I got these slate tests and aggregate stability tests. Ray, Ray worked for the NRCS and other places, but great soil people, really from the agricultural side of soil management. But they said something that I'll never forget. It was aggregate stability will only regenerate biologically. For the longest time, I was really interested in soil amendments. How can we change things within our soils, whether it's adding compost, adding leaf debris, you name it, I've tried it. But for me, this really changed the game. Understanding that plants are the driver for building soil, and that's how our soil is going to regenerate only biologically. And so that's the key, and that's what we're really going to focus on today. So that diagram there, I think that explains it best. You have a plant root, and then you have these mycorrhizal fungi that actually break into that plant root. But also those hyphae are going to be making their way into the aggregates of soil. Okay, and that's the connection. You've got a direct link from plant root to soil via mycorrhizal fungi. And if you look at these pictures on the right, those are smooth brome roots. And Ray and Rudy like to say they didn't like to see clean roots because if you pulled your plant out of the ground, there were no clean roots. Or if there were clean roots, your roots aren't making that association with the soil. They're really just living in there for the time being. They're not actually becoming part of the system. But what we really want to see are plant roots that have these soil globs basically colonizing all over them at the finest root hairs. And that's that same one under a crude microscope. And you can see it. There's little bitty globs of soil building around that root. And so when we blow that out, that's really what's allowing water to rush into that soil clod and it retain its structure versus it flaking and falling off. And for me, it's all about restoring these connections. We're restoring the connection from the sun to the soil. The plants, they're really just this intermediary. And so today I'm not going to focus on so many specific plants, but more the role that diverse plant communities play in that process. Um, so you could say we're restoring the prairie, but I think we're also just restoring the soil and its potential to express those plants. My journey, aside from Ray and Rudy, has really been guided by Dr. Christine Jones. I would love to meet her someday. I think she's a phenomenal person. And this was an excerpt from an Australian farm journal back in '08. And this is from a page called The Liquid Carbon Pathway. And I encourage you to jump on our website there and check out some of her work. But I wanted to just highlight a couple things she said. This first one here is called Turning Air into Soil. Before I jump into that, trees have a similar process. We can turn air into wood. It's the process of lignification in trees. So you're taking carbon from the atmosphere, it goes through a biologic process in the tree, it gets stored as wood for a long time. However, as wood breaks down, decomposes, gets burned, it eventually will get returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But what this is getting at is how do we turn air into soil, which is really, I believe, the ultimate long term stable place that carbon can get drawn down. And we need the carbon. So I'll just read this to you. The formation of topsoil requires photosynthesis to capture carbon dioxide in green leaves, followed by exudation of simple sugars from plant roots and humification within biologically active soil aggregates. So that's the connection from sun to soil there. Humification is a process whereby simple carbon compounds are joined together into more complex and stable molecules. The formation of humus requires a vast array of soil microbes, including fungi, bacteria, all of these which obtain their energy from plant sugars or liquid carbon. Okay, carbon feeds this system. All the life in the soil, everything is driven through carbon. They get that through plants. So humification, this is the soil's version of storing carbon, right? So under appropriate conditions, a large portion of soluble carbon that gets channeled into the aggregates via the hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi undergoes humification, a process which simple sugars are resynthesized into complex carbon polymers. These are essentially organomineral complexes that are stable in the soil hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, so if we can build a diverse plant matrix that can support pumping all this carbon down into our soil system, then all of a sudden our soil has the potential to retain more water, infiltrate it more quickly. Really, we're starting to get to a climate resilient garden or landscape at that point. And so today we'll look at two different restoration projects that we've done here on site, thinking about soil as our kind of guiding principle through these. The first we'll look at is the riparian habitat, kind of a twofold restoration project, and then a prairie restoration, developing what we call an oak savanna. Some of the similarities between both projects, removing non-native species and our site preparation, the goal of seeding diverse mix of native plants, and how are we going to maintain long-term diversity. Initially, we had kind of simple goals: establish native plants, host insects, build soil, and increase diversity over time. I think if I had to reword that currently, it would be to maximize the photosynthetic potential with plants best suited for our region that survive on less resources and provide the most ecological benefit. To me, that's the ultimate landscape, and it checks all the boxes for me. Climate ready, captures every bit of moisture, and really can survive off less resources. And so the first part of this project was a long-term, really low impact restoration along Deer Creek. Deer Creek's an ephemeral stream running through our property. It's a tributary of the South Flats. Currently, it empties actually into Chatfield Reservoir. It looked like we had some people from Chatfield on this call, so hello, folks. Glad to see some restoration work over there as well. But this was a cool long-term, low-impact strategy. So that photo on the left, you can see they're called BDAs, essentially, a beaver dam analog. And what they're supposed to do is just mimic the work of those beavers I was showing you earlier, where they will slowly impound the water to slow it down. And now that water has a chance to braid out over the floodplain. It can re-wet all of these old oxbows, and we're really, we're not creating a new wetland. We're really just re-wetting an historic stream channel. So where it's been channelized in the past, you really need either beavers or, in this case, we went in with these structures to mimic that work. And so now what you get, at least during high flows, are a shift in your hydrological cycle. So we're slowing down the deposition of sediment downstream, probably getting some water cleaning qualities out of it. All of those trees are finally getting a drink again yearly, which is wonderful. And it creates a wet place for seed to drop. So as those cottonwoods and box elders are seeding, they once again have a wet stream bed to deposit their seed into. And I can't tell you how long it's been since these areas have been re-wetted. And the idea is that over time, that shift in hydrology will actually shift the plant communities. So this is going to be a really long-term strategy, but it had minimal impact to a lot of the surrounding wildlife. We didn't have to come in and clear cut an area to restore. It's simply seeing if we can shift the way water's moving on the landscape and how that might impact things going forward. And there's that water returning back to the creek on one of those oxbows. it was almost immediate. The ducks and other waterfowl that flocked to those areas. So anecdotally, at least up front, there's been a shift in the ecology. I think the plant shift in those communities is going to be much slower. But our research and conservation department, they have transects throughout there where they do monitor and see if those plants are shifting over time. There was one other area that we identified as being a former oxbow. The problem was is we had permanent trails within our park through there. So we decided we didn't want to actively reflood this area. Since we're a multi-use site, we support weddings. We have a massive horticulture department. We have a community-supported agriculture program. So there's a lot of needs on our site for these spaces. So what we did instead was we took this half-acre site and created a riparian demonstration garden. And for me, this was, I think, spring of 2016. This has really shaped my career moving forward in, getting those initial seeds on the ground and having to manage that. It's really been a guiding force for the prairie project I'll share with you in a bit. But we cleaned up the ground with a combination of herbicide and mechanical invasive plant removal. And then we came in and seeded the area with a really diverse mix of seeds that were collected by our research department in a lot of neighboring counties off our own site. And then we also bought in a lot of local seed as well. And so it was really fun. We essentially seeded the same mix over the entire area and have kind of watched it sort itself out over time. And so I'll take you on that journey from bare soil to what we are now. I think this garden probably produces the most biomass of any garden on our site. And that just creates, like I said, a solar panel on every one of those plants, absorbing sunlight, pumping that down into the ground. That's what I see when I look at these landscapes. But you get these wonderful expressions. You get a lot of competition that's very different from a traditionally planted garden. Natives really duking it out, and it changes year to year. And like I said, we seeded the same mix everywhere, but different exposures really have changed the expression of what this garden looks like. These are some of my favorite little vignettes from previous years that I like to revisit each season. Whether it's Monarda and Rudbeckia, or the middle picture where you have swamp milkweed and a ridgeron, or marsh sunflowers dancing over everything. There's plants making their way everywhere, and depending on the season, if it's wet, you get one expression. If it's a dry year, you might get a different one. But the idea is that the garden becomes dynamic and that it can respond to those changes. And really thinking about diversity at all different levels, right? I think I removed between 50 and 60 Siberian elms from this half acre until we got down to a canopy of box elders and cottonwood. And we were really missing our shrub level. So we came in and we planted a lot of flowering shrubs like boulder raspberry and woods rose. But then even down in the little wet portions that used to be a creek bed, there's sedges and rushes. Um, and then maybe my favorite grass on the left there, Cytos grama. If you catch it at the right time of the year, it's just beautiful. And this garden, to me, if I could explain it, it's just quickly becoming full of life. Plants are hosting insects. There are critters everywhere. I once had a former colleague tell me, pretty uncomfortable to get in here and weed when you can't see your feet. And it's so true. It's just a jungle of biomass in a good way. But take a minute. I got a quiz for you here. See how many caterpillars you can find within these two pictures. They were plants right next to each other. I'm pretty sure they're white-lined sphinx moths, but you get different variations of them at different stages. I came up with eight, and so that's just two plants, right next to each other. And when we think of producing high-quality habitat, this is a really good indicator. When we've got what I call bird food, really these caterpillars are such a high-calorie food source for birds in spring and summer that if we can produce native plants that native insects are allowed to host on, that starts to complete that life cycle. And then I think we really start to see the increase in larger predators up that food chain. But how cool to see that. They were eating a Enothera biensis, and then I think that's false Solomon seal off to the side of them there. And so now we'll switch gears. I went kind of briefly through that riparian restoration, but a lot of what we learned through that, I'll go into more detail about the actual application for getting that work on the ground. So this is a picture from this past summer. This is a 3 or 4 year old meadow. Sometimes I get lost depending on where I am in that space. But I'll talk to you about our ground preparation, some of our seed mixes, and our seeding process, a little bit about maintenance, and talk about managing irrigation as well, because I have it on this site, and so that's an advantage. And I think there's a lot of landscapes throughout the metro area and the Front Range that are probably underutilized turf grass areas that have irrigation. And I think this could be a really natural fit to restore those areas into something like this. If you got the infrastructure, this program works pretty well for that. But keep in mind, this is a site-specific protocol that we've developed for our site here. But I really enjoy sharing it so people can adapt to what they have in their toolbox. So here we go. This was developing in Oak Savannah. So there's kind of a Google Photos overview of it. We have one of our wedding facilities, our outdoor chapel there, which is a really nice garden. And then around it, I've got this big horseshoe that's almost 2 acres, about 75,000 square feet. And that's what we were looking to restore. It's dominant smooth brome. And so that's what my challenge was. We were going to do it over 7 to 10 years, and we're kind of right in the middle of that process. You can also see all those little bitty tree wells. I think we planted 57 different oak seedlings throughout this garden. And I appreciate some of my folks down at York Street, like Kevin Williams, coming out to help me lay these out, and a lot of my Chatfield folks helping us get those installed. And so the trees went in 2021, but you can see where my cursor is, this green patch here. This was our first test site in 2020. And so really my director, Larry Bickerman, was the leader on starting to see what this area could look like if we tried to restore it. And then the vision really came along to restore the whole area and create an oak savanna. So started in 2020, and we'll go to kind of where we are now. So the very first thing is you got to get rid of what you have, and it's not a glamorous part of the process. Often the part I don't look forward to, but I gotta say it is one of the most critical stages in the long-term success of these plantings. Competition from really aggressive non-native plants, as you folks know, they can outcompete the native ones that we want. So I started by eliminating that. For us, smooth brome, cool season grass, I get the most effective control early in the spring, when it's actively growing. So you're still getting that dusting of snow on the foothills, but things are really starting to wake up. Trees haven't quite budded out yet, but that grass is like 6 to 8 inches tall. And that's where I'll go through and make a broadcast herbicide application to remove that grass. That's my spray rig there. It's a John Deere 320S. It's actually a pretty rare tractor from like the late 50s. So shout out to our mechanic Jim Sell for restoring that. It's pretty neat. We are a historic farm, and so getting to use some of these old pieces of equipment is it feels right. But I use a 5% mixture of glyphosate. For me, it's Roundup Pro Max is the chemical that I choose to use. Um, but you really want to make an appropriate application at the best time, and that's where I find it to be the most effective with minimizing your respray. So first broadcast application, we'll knock that down. And so here you can see kind of a side by side. On the right hand side, that green is a newly seeded meadow. And then right there to the left, I had to come in and clean up brome grass to the left of it. And one of the lessons I really learned was focusing on those edges. Even in the bottom of that picture where it's brown, you'll see little bits of green popping back up. That is not something to overlook. Okay. That is actually something that I actively seek to find any regrowth, particularly of smooth brome, but also any other, exotic perennial weeds in particular. But if you're doing these in stages like I am, and I recommend doing that, don't bite off more than you can maintain. But the tricky part was I didn't always get that edge cleaned up. And so I found that over time, I've had little bits of brome that have snuck in on those edges where I got scared to spray into my newly seeded area. So just a lesson I've learned that, it's worth going into your newly seeded area and spraying that edge just a little bit to go ahead and make sure that you are getting that brome taken care of. And then we've got to decide how to do our ground and the seed bed. And so keeping soil in our mind, this is where our management decisions really come into play. Is what are we going to use to disturb the soil to go from sprayed brome grass to be able to put seeds on the ground? And so this is my tool of choice. This is a tool I got from our CSA agriculture program, and it's called a power harrow. It's instead of a traditional tiller where the tines spin, one over the other and really displace a lot of soil underneath it. This works more like a small blender. So I can raise and lower that implement and have pretty darn good control of just stirring that top portion of the soil. And why is that important? Well, like I showed earlier, brome grass likes tillage. So the more tillage I introduce, I'm breaking up the soil structure that I wanted to retain, and I'm also probably just pissing off that brome grass and it's going to come back full force. So those are some of the key things I've learned to help suppress that from coming back. So power harrow, it's a pretty cool tool. You can go, half inch to an inch pretty easily and retain a lot of your soil structure down below. Our farm crew also has a walk behind version. That big tractor, that's heavy. Those tires have a compacting, effect on the soil. And so sometimes, you've got to match the amount of impact you want to make to the size of your equipment. And so for me, this is also an option. It's the same power harrow on the back, but this is operated behind a BCS walk behind tractor. And so it's really good for minimizing the depth of your disturbance. Like I said, retaining that soil structure. You avoid stirring up the seed bank. On a beat up old farm like ours, as my director says, it's the who's who of noxious weeds when you stir it up. So if I don't have to expose those and give them a chance to germinate and keep them lower in that seed bank, that's the idea. And so tillage is one of those key things that can dictate how that outcome goes. And this one's ideal for small acres. And here you can kind of see it in action. So on the left-hand side, that was a field that I had gotten rid of the brome and spot sprayed out the perennial weeds. And now you can see I had a huge flush of annual weeds, purslane, a lot of other things like that. And so this power harrow was a perfect little tool with just two passes to pluck out all those seedlings and actually create a pretty nice seed bed to where I can go in and actually actively seed to restore. That was a 5,000 acre site. Much bigger than that, it gets a little iffy on the shoulder. So, this past season I was prepping a site that was about 25,000 square feet. And so for that, I choose to use the big tractor. Sure, I am putting those tires down on the ground more than I'd like to, but you got to save your body too a little bit. And so for me, it was getting the power harrow on the back of the big tractor, and then you can see I kind of did the same thing. There's my first pass through there on the left, and then I think this area ended up making three passes. Um, I've really grown to think that soil can tolerate repeated tillage at very shallow depths, but it really doesn't like it at any more than that. So I'll repeat that until I get down to really bare ground. Maintenance tip here on the left, where my cursor is. See those little patches of green around those trees? Those are areas that got missed from my sprayer. I get a little gun shy when I'm using the big boom sprayer around my little bitty tree seedlings. So I often will miss portions around those trees. Um, it could be really easy just to till those under, pretend they weren't there, but I really advise not doing that. I take the time to come back with a backpack sprayer, make an application on those, and then come back and till them at a later time when the ground is died back. And so don't rush the process is really my take home message there. But there you can see we've gone from a field of brome down to bare ground within half a season. At this point, I do something a little bit different. And I'm not sure if other folks are using this in restoration, but it's really fit in nicely with my program. I installed silage tarps at this point, and I first saw this with our farm crew. So they grow vegetables with organic practices. And so herbicides are not a tool in their toolbox, and for good reason. They're producing food for us. And so they often would use these silage tarps as a way to transition their beds, manage soil, or eradicate plants that they didn't want. And so I've used it for similar regions. So after I make that power harrow tillage, I've basically got my ground hopefully rid of perennial weeds that I could get to show up, and the seed bed is prepped for for the seeding next spring. But I don't want bare ground sitting there all season long. And so I'll install these silage tarps over the top of it. I irrigate it quite heavily before I do that, um, and that gives it the most benefit. And really, the idea is that if you get moisture in the ground, you're going to trap that moisture in the soil. You're going to heat it up slowly. So a lot of folks will use a clear plastic. They'll call it solarization. Uh, they're similar, just in the fact that one lets light through and one doesn't. And so these black tarps actually will absorb that sunlight, and so it'll actually heat it up much slower. But the idea is that that warm, environment is going to encourage germination. And so if all the annual species that are probably still in the system will germinate and exhaust themselves because they don't have access to sunlight, I've taken out a whole herbicide application from my program there. And so for me, that's a big win. It's a little bit labor intensive, but you get some herbicide out of the program. And so it's a really neat way to manage ground that maybe you know you got to do something with, but you can't seed until the next season. So yes, I've seen it work in 4 to 6 weeks, and a lot of farming applications in the heat of the season, you can get pretty good transition of a bed in 4 to 6 weeks. I leave them on a lot longer. I put them on in like August, and I'll leave them till April. So I'm about to seed. Um, and I'm still not sure what that does to the soil. It could have some downside to it, but I think all in all, reducing my herbicide is the biggest thing. And for all of you wondering, it does not get rid of field vine. You can suppress it, but it still will grow. And at this point, what I do is I go through with a really sharp weeding hoe, and I'll just slice all of those off. So although I haven't gotten rid of the bindweed, the idea is that we can really get a jump start ahead of it and suppress it. And I think that's the best we can hope for. So here's that same area that I had tarps on. This is the following spring. So that would be this spring here that we seeded this area. Um, for me, soil temperatures are really the driving factor for when we're going to seed. Anything colder than 50-degree soil temps, I don't think we're maximizing our germination potential. So, you need a really scientific, good cook thermometer there from your local grocery store. And that's really what I use to give me a base. In the spring, those tarps are an advantage for that as well, because while a lot of the other soil temps are pretty low, that tarp will heat it up in the spring as well and kind of help me get a jump start to when we can seed. And this is kind of a baseline seed mix that we're using. This was roughly for a 5,000 square foot section. And when I say base mix, this is the mix that we're applying over to the whole area, knowing that it's not going to be represented everywhere, but it gives us a pretty darn good mix of forbs and grasses. Our goal is 30 to 35 species, and I think our base mix starts with 26. So that's kind of where we've landed. You can always do more, or you could do less, but I think added diversity is is what we're always striving for. And you can see a lot of these plants. They are plants that are native to Colorado, although the seed source may not be. They're collected from all over the West. And so for me, it works in my restoration purposes. But some of our research and conservation department, they're really trying to answer those tougher questions about, do our seed sources need to be more localized, and what does that look like? And so it's something I'm mindful of, but also this is, what we've had available, and it's cost effective, and I think we can get pretty reliable seed from Western native. And to add to our base mix, there's some plants that we like to seed individually. So things you may want to put in a swath here or there, or some species that you don't want, to be growing at large scales all over your site, but that you want to really punctuate different spots. Or maybe you've got a wet, low depression or kind of a high, dry, rocky area. Those are all opportunities to grow a little bit of diversity within these gardens. And so for me, things like Castanea, um, this astragalus in the middle, Coreopsis tinctoria, like I use the snot out of Coreopsis tinctoria, especially in the first year. It's really a great showstopper. Um, and so those are fun. You can add a little diversity to these plantings and make them all look a little different by including some individually seeded species. So when I prepare my seed mix, um, it really starts over the winter. This time of the year, I'm finalizing what seed mixes I want, ordering them up, and then it's starting to estimate when our seeding date may be. And so, like I said, soil temperatures are really the driver for when we do it. But I need to give myself a window, and usually that's going to be late April through early June. So I'm hoping I can seed sometime within that period. And why that's important to me is because I actually will cold treat our forb seeds. Um, it gives us a unique advantage, the combination of irrigation and being able to prime these seeds. It gives our restoration. And so what I mean by this cool moist stratification is I take the forb seed and I exclude all the grasses. I order all those separately, and then I mix those forb mixes with damp vermiculite, not soaking wet, really just damp. And the idea is that I mix all that up in like a 50-50 ratio, and then those go in the fridge for 30 to 45 days. 45 days is kind of my target goal. And the idea is that those seeds are hydrating with the moisture in those bags, but they're also going through a simulated winter, and seeing if we can just trigger some of those mechanisms, help them break dormancy early as we seed them out. Um, sorry, yeah. So prime seed, it can be tricky. In the fridge, they can mold. I check on them like once a week to see, are they moldy? Are they too saturated? Are they too dry? It's kind of a delicate balance. Um, but each of these plants treated individually, in a greenhouse setting, they all have probably different germination requirements. For me and for us, it's how can we capture the majority and get them into a condition where they all have a chance. And that's really where this comes from, is priming the seed. That way, um, they've got a chance to get going early. And you don't always get everything to come up, and that's the beauty of these things. They change over time. But that 30 to 45 day mark with our seed mix, that's what we found to give us really the best germination that we can find diversity wise across a large scale. So this is our seeding process. On these smaller acreages, I'm really a fan of hand seeding. There's my director, Larry. We were trying to run a seeder one day, but since those seeds were moist and they had vermiculite on them, they didn't run through that seeder very well. So essentially, we just seed them by hand. We take our seed and mix it with sand. At that point, we do incorporate the grass mixes into them, and then we go in a grid and broadcast that seed all over the entire area, really trying to get as even coverage as we can. Once we've seeded it, it's kind of a ticking clock. We can't let that seed dry out. And so as soon as we seed it, we flip a rake over and we walk around the whole area and we back rake it, it's called. And really that just displaces a little bit of soil on top of those seeds. And then I'll take a turf roller, like in the bottom right picture there, and I'll actually roll and press those seeds into the ground. And what I learned is seed to soil contact is really, really critical. Before I had this roller, we would walk sites and press them in with our feet. So it's important. That's a step you don't want to miss. So back rake it, press it in, but then we irrigate it immediately. Since those seeds have already been hydrated, if they dry out, we're kind of cooked. And so that's where you got to be primed and ready with your irrigation to at least keep them moist. One new thing I've added this year is trying to incorporate, a fungally rich extract. Going back to earlier in the presentation, that marriage between seed, root, soil, and fungi. That's really what I'm after. And so once we seeded our area, I had this prepared mixture, call it my compost juice. Um, but really, it's supposed to be a highly fungal rich con- compost extract. And the acronym BEAM it stands for Biologically Enhanced Agricultural Management. And this idea originally came from New Mexico State University and Dr. David Johnson and his wife when they were creating what's called these bioreactors, basically a no-turn compost reactor to create a highly fungal compost. And so for me, that's exciting. I want to get that stuff coated on the seeds, see if it'll help us germinate. And so what I do is I'll take that compost and I'll mix it up in a 5 gallon bucket, run it through a paint strainer several times, and really get as much of that organic matter kind of stirred away from the wonderful life in that compost. And you want to get it down to a sprayable form so it won't clog up your sprayer. And so after I strained it, I sprayed that whole area, crossed my fingers, and hoped for the best. And I was so excited to see. We did have a wet spring, so I don't know if that's where the fungi is coming from, but I like to think it was our inoculation. And so here you've got seedlings emerging with fungi as well. And that's why I put that picture back there. I think that the ultimate success in restoration and for plants to be able to survive on their own is establishing that relationship and seeds germinating in that environment. Um, that's an instant start, and I think that's super cool. And like I said, you got to water immediately if you're priming seed the way we are. And so I think about it as a water investment. I'd invest my water early in the first 2 weeks. And so for me, sometimes that's multiple waterings for very short duration throughout that first 2 weeks, usually, or until you get pretty consistent germination across your site. Baby in it is probably the best way I can describe it. But if I wasn't going to be able to water it after anything else, I would invest my water budget in that first 2 weeks to get seeds up. And then you find cool things like this Liatris seed, getting ready to blow away as the plant is emerging. And then by this time, as you start to see some true leaves, these plants are putting roots down. I have been shocked as I dig up some of these just to see how far their roots are down at this stage. Some of them are 5 or 6 inches deep. And so when we're thinking about managing our soil moisture at this level, we're not just watering anymore for the seedlings in the top half inch of soil. We got to start thinking about, are we watering at depth to encourage these roots to really grow down? By the time I can see this sheen of green over that whole site, I can finally take a breath. I feel like we've got plants establishing, and we're well on our way to a fun season. But that picture on the right, when I think about investing in roots, that's the beauty of all these prairie plants. Is I think that's a silphium there. This was an exhibit the Land Institute put on. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall, and that's well beyond my reach. And that's just the root system of a compass plant. And so that is really what we're going for. We want these deep rooted plants to be resilient. And so, what can you expect your first year? I think these seeded prairies and seeded meadows sometimes get a bad rap of, well, you won't see anything for the first 2 years. Um, And depending on your situation, that may be true. But I think under these conditions, with prime seed, all of a sudden you get a huge first year flush of flowers. Since our grasses did not go through that priming, they're a little bit slower to the party. They've got to kind of naturally sort out. And so you get a really cool big bloom of your first year. And this is where it's important to use species within your mix that thrive on disturbance or less competition. Things like Cleome, or Coreopsis tinctoria, Linum lewisii, Rudbeckia hirta. Those are often a lot of the first year species that dominate the plant matrix. And then over time, they'll subside as the competition increases or if as their disturbed environment becomes less disturbed. But I'm pretty happy with that for a first year seeding. And let them seed. That's really our first year motto is we try to, if I can, I try to let everything go to seed that first year. And what's important to that is we're kind of starting to rebuild that seed bank to where if disturbance happens, either from me or from a climatic event, um, I want the next generation of plants to respond to the offspring of these plants. I don't want there to be a huge seed bank of weeds that are ready to rock and roll. And so through spending time in the cleanup phase, allowing all these plants to seed, now you're starting to recapture the dynamic aspects of how these landscapes can respond with native plants. And being the botanic gardens, we do have some advantages like a greenhouse, and I'm very thankful for that. And so there are some species that we struggle to get to germinate under our conditions. Penstemons have been notoriously tricky in certain areas, things like Artemisia frigida. And so oftentimes I'll use those as transplants along the edges. The ultimate goal is diversity. And so if there's a way we can get these plants in there, that's still a good thing. You'll see in that bottom left photo, I pretty much keep my transplants to the edges along the pathways. That way, if I do have to supplemental water anything by hand, I can find them. And they'll get lost in the middle of the prairie. So I don't recommend planting them in the middle if you don't have to. And this also adds kind of a unique design element to it where you can take these natural spaces and give it a little bit of dimension. I love these big prairie jewel penstemon kind of dotting my path through there. And then over time, they'll blend in. They really start to look less like an intentional transplanted planting for those edges, and they really look more like a wild garden because there's seeds mixed in with them. And then by year 2, 3, 4, you really start to see the plant distribution change. So we've gone from less of those year one species. You really don't see Coreopsis tinctoria in this picture, for example, or even black-eyed Susan. Um, they don't love as the competition gets more stiff, but then you get a lot of these other plants that start to mingle. And this is really when I noticed the grasses starting to take place and kind of hold on. Here in the foreground, it's like panicum, but we have a lot of big blue stem, little blue, you name it. There's a bunch of different grasses in here. But having 2 years of mostly orb seed drop in, we've got a pretty good bank building, and now the grass is in play. And diversity will change over time. I can't tell you how many fun little surprises I found out in the middle of this prairie. Sometimes at a glance, it may look all yellow from the outside, but as you really get in there and walk around, you'll find a whole bunch of different species like calero growing along the ground, like in this picture on the right, with a whole number of different native plants. I mean, look at all those different little solar panels grabbing sun, covering the ground. Um, Really, a lot of these soil health principles that are used in agriculture, they really apply to restoration too. And this is a story I like to tell about this gravel path. It really taught me a lot in this year's seeding. So the picture on the top left, you can see there was an old pathway through this area at some point, and it's got kind of a low gravelly depression where it's a little more compacted. As we move to the bottom left photo, you can see the plants. You can still see a difference. They were growing a little slower, definitely a little drier in there. This was the same seed mix as the whole area. and then boom, it finally happened. Like the plant expression is totally different within that gravel pathway. And I just thought that was so cool. It really taught me the nuances of these microclimates and these micro environments. If you have a little gravelly soil or if you have different drainage, those are opportunities to host different plants. And so where we might have different species, now we have things like this little Origeron and Castanea dominating these low areas, these little dry spots. And so that was a big teacher for me. It's also led to areas where I'll actively incorporate a little bit of gravel into different areas to seed things that are dry loving or like better drainage. Whatever we can do to help recruit more and more plants. And then really you get a different seasonal expression. I think the best compliment I can get when I come out here is when folks ask me, "Has this always been here?" And I just love that. I think in a way, yes, the ecological memory has always been there. Um, it just needed a little nudge, and so that's what we're trying to do is get that ecological memory back in the system to where it looks like it should belong, and it does belong. And as we go into even the shoulder season, I think the light playing off the grasses is like a perfect accent to the dominant colors we have through our riparian forest in the background. And in the winter too, you get a lot of interesting seed heads, and just the contrast between the snow and the plants themselves. And these plant communities are resilient. That's what we need is we need plants that can tough it out. Most of our storms come in really quick, really high intensity bursts. Hailstorm on the left, or the spring flooding we had this year on the right. We need a garden that can capture that. And what I mean by capture is they stop the impact of the moisture, whether it's hail, rain, snow. They slow it down. They help spread it out along the landscape and really soak it in. And that's the idea, is we want to capture that moisture. If we have a soil that can tolerate it and that can handle those pressures because it's aggregated, oh yeah, now we can capture that. I don't fear these moments as much. It's almost like they're adding to my water budget, which is nice. I put an asterisk by this one because I'm always pushing the envelope a little bit on what's the norm around here. Um, I got inspired by some other talks on nesting habitat for solitary insects, especially bees. And so I played around with mowing different strips at different heights to try to create some nesting habitat. I'm not sure my director loved the look of it, but I think the idea is we need to keep moving forward in our maintenance. You can easily just mow everything and not think twice about it. But I think having mindful decisions while we're doing some of these maintenance tasks, they can provide habitat. And so I think that's, although this may not be the perfect application, I think we need to find areas where we, have a place for these insects and critters to overwinter. But when it comes to maintaining diversity, it's one thing to try to seed and establish diversity initially. Like I said, these things change over time. Good years and bad years, whether it's dry, whether it's wet, you name it. There's a bunch of different factors that play into what plants are going to emerge for the season. And so one of the tools we can do is with our mowing. In a traditional, natural setting, you might have big herds of herbivores, whether it be bison, elk. There might be periodic fires that came through here, large intense wind and hailstorm. A lot of those naturally occurring things, um, they introduce disturbance. But we've lost a lot of those from the landscape. And for me in particular, it's the loss of grazing animals and the reduction in our ability to burn. And so what we do is we try to mimic some of that in a way with our mowing practices. And I'm still learning this. My boss takes me out each spring and we talk about mowing techniques and how we can do it differently. And it often starts with what piece of equipment. So that's a flail mower there. It's not a mower that spins with a circular blade like a traditional lawnmower at home. This has teeth that kind of spin over, and you can nick the ground with them. And so what we'll do is we'll drive around, and you can see in this picture I leave some areas kind of high, almost unmowed, and then 6 feet later I'll drop that mower all the way to the ground, and I'll actually beat up the surface of the soil and kind of break up some of those grasses and other things. And what that's doing is it's creating little pockets of disturbance within the prairie. Some of those species that may disappear, like Coreopsis, for example, or Rocky Mountain bee plant. Some of those things you see in the first year that you don't see in year three. This is how we're trying to get those back. So the idea is that we disturb the ground enough to where those species have a chance. Ideally, their seed is down on the ground or in the seed bank, and they have an opportunity to show up. So it's kind of a fun way to try to encourage diversity over time. We used to do a little more burning when I first started here, but that also is a good tool, when used safely for removing biomass, adding a little bit of nutrition, from that debris, but also really thinning out the grass population and giving those forbs kind of a reset to come back to the party. There's kind of a short video of one of our prairie sections being burned. And this is an older prairie planting that our director put in 16 or so years ago. I started managing it when I showed up in 2015. And a story I like to tell about this is when I first started managing it, there was no lead plant to be found in here. It's really pretty native shrubs in the front. And it wasn't until after this burn, we burned that area, and all of a sudden, lead plant really responded and started showing up all over that prairie. And it taught me a lesson. Introduced disturbance does maintain diversity. And some plants need fire, like that may be their trigger or their mechanism for germination. And so, although we may have seeded those originally, they may not ever show up until there's something like a burn through there. And so that's part of my role moving forward is trying to introduce fire safely back onto our landscape. And sometimes our introduction of disturbance is a combination of herbicide and fire. So this was back in our riparian area where smooth brome had kind of recolonized this big chunk here. And so there was an herbicide application made to remove it, and then the ground was burned. And I thought, oh, great. Are we going to have a bunch of thistles that come back here? And to my surprise, it wasn't. It was Origeron and Rudbeckia that really showed up. That was a big learning moment for me, where often I think we're not rough enough on our landscape, and this showed me that yeah, disturbance can actually improve the landscape. And for me, it goes back to kind of the central core of what Chatfield is, and what our indicators of success with these projects are. And I think it's the daily interaction with visitors and how they interact with our plants and wildlife, seeing these insects, seeing the full life cycle of everything. That's really key for our success. And beyond that, it's making Chatfield home, like that cute little American dagger moth. They love box elder trees. And if you don't have box elders in your riparian areas, you're not going to have this wonderful little caterpillar and then the moth as well. But also other larger animals like a bobcat or great horned owl. When animals are not only just visiting our site, but actually reproducing on our site, to me, that's really, really key when understanding that we have enough habitat for them not only to visit, but survive and rear young. I think that's a really cool complement for our work. But it's that combination of having large expanses of natural areas and then also having some really intensive restored areas. And when we think about our farm as a whole, we're a dynamic site. We do weddings, we have big events and light shows and corn mazes and pumpkin festivals. It's not just about one thing. And so a lot of my work can help offset some of these other areas that maybe are more intensely farmed or more intensely used for different purposes. And so when we think of large scale land management, having high quality habitat restoration incorporated within all these other land management practices, I think it's a really cool example of where agriculture, horticulture, forestry, and restoration are really all heading together. Okay, I'll take a quick breath here. That was kind of a whirlwind of going through our restoration But I think what we're going to try to do is set up a field day to where you folks can come out and we can visit these on site. You know, come out in the spring or early summer, and it's really really pleasant. I wouldn't be much of an arborist if I didn't also talk to you a little bit about the fun trees that got planted in that oak savanna. And so a lot of these trees are not going to be specifically native to Colorado. But if we expand our view of regionally native, I think these trees all come from areas that go through similar climates, or maybe they're a climate model for us in the next 20 to 50 years. And so these are potentially really good trees. Um, I got to say, I'm really blessed. Alan Taylor, who was a wonderful plantsman up in northern Colorado, um, Alan was really fascinated with oak species, particularly around the Southwest U.S. And before Alan passed away, I was gifted a big chunk of his collection, and so those are the majority of the collection that went into this oak savanna. And so I just wanted to share and highlight a couple of my favorite ones and talk about where they come from. So here we go. This is King Canute. King Canute is from kind of off I-40 there in Oklahoma. My King Canute is kind of small, but there you go. That's the parent tree. And I get excited about this because, as soon as I start thinking all the plants have been discovered, there's amazing plants out there that are yet to be discovered. Like this wonderful oak here. I think King Canute does fit that name there. I was born and raised in New Mexico, so I'm a big fan of a lot of these little trees that come from that area. A lot drier typically, but high elevation and still very cold. And I think that's where we're headed along this front range. So this little cute guy is tinny. It's a Quercus undulata species. It comes from near the Capitan Mountains in southern New Mexico. You might be familiar with Smokey the Bear. Smokey the Bear comes from that area as well. But there's a really interesting population between the town of Tinney and north of there, there's a little town of Arabella. And that's where these really neat wavy leaf oaks come from. This one here, Quercus San Lorenzo. This is coming from Grant County, New Mexico. And I show them all these leaf types because so many of them don't look like our traditional oak leaf. And it just adds a really fun feature to the garden. But Grant County, we're down in the Gila here, a really neat area in New Mexico and the U.S. in general. They have some really, really massive, beautiful oak trees. Um, I think Plant Select is coming out with the Gila Monster. It's basically a tree form of a gamble oak, and it comes from a little bit different area. Fascinating oak population. Here on the western slope in Colorado, we've got Quercus undulata. This is Dolores River, um, coming from north of the Durango area, but further out on the western edge. A little bit closer to home here, this is a selection made out of Canyon City. I have not yet made it down to see the parent tree, but this is one they named Phantom Holly. I love all these names. This one's probably been one of the quicker growers, one of the top three, I think, of all the undulatas, really all the trees. This one here is Quercus Jack Mays. Isn't that a cool leaf type there? Really deep cut leaves. This is like the last one. This is probably the other really fast grower. Let me check my notes. Yeah, it's Macrocarpa and Gambelii. So I think some of these that have Baroque lineage in them are hopefully going to be some of our larger trees. But if you see where it comes from, it doesn't necessarily just scream oak to you. This area along southeast Colorado, right near that Panhandle area, big grasslands, but they do have unique canyons and different other areas that host these neat oaks. This one comes from not too far from there. This is a post oak, not something you see a ton of around here in the red oak family. This is Lady Luck for all you gamblers out there, and this comes from the huge city of Folsom, New Mexico. If you travel through Folsom, New Mexico, pretty interesting little place, but in a cool part of northeast part of the state. Okay, another one from that same kind of area. You'll see he made a lot of collections of different species, all within the same region. And this is Tollgate Canyon, another undulata species. Um, really cute little leaf. And finally, the last tree I wanted to share with you is Eric the Red. Okay, that's not how I spell my name, but I'm thinking about changing it. And this tree comes from out off I-40 again, um, in Beckham County, Oklahoma. And you can see it's got kind of this like Patrick Star shaped leaf. It's really funny. And there's the parent tree. Not a lot of really true red fall color on some of these oaks that aren't like a true red oak. And so I think that's really, really beautiful. And I'll leave you with this. That's the winter form of it. And I got to tell you, the arborist in me is like dying to go climb this tree. Thank you all so much. I'll stop chatting and I'll see if we can do some time for questions here.
Thanks, Eric. That was awesome. Um, if anybody has any questions, if you guys just want to write them in the chat and we'll have Eric answer them.
I heard there might be a Chatfield crew watch party tonight. So shout out to my crews watching. Thank you all.
I guess I have a question that I'll ask. Um, I'm curious, how much weed maintenance are you having to do on each restoration site? And as plants become like more established year to year, do you see a decrease in invasive species?
Yeah, darn good question. It's been different in each seeding. And so I think there's some like environmental triggers that I can't quite like identify yet, but I'll give you a couple examples. Um, First thing in the spring, really a good chunk of my effective weeding is early in the spring when things are just small, because then I can get in there, I can see stuff. The challenge is identifying things, and so those are kind of the hard parts of it. But some plants like Potentia recta, which is highly invasive, that for some reason only shows up after we've seeded. I can't ever get it to like show up prior to a seeding. Things like mullein, seem to persist after our cleanup phase. Even things like sweet clover, for example, like those three have been kind of annoying to me. I'm like, why can't I figure out how to get rid of you before we see things? And so what I've kind of done is early and often in my weed management. So whether that's spot spraying with a backpack or I use just really sharp, like long handled weeding hose for mullein in particular, like you just slice that nick off that mullein, slice the leaves off. You're not digging things up necessarily. So for me, it's trying to manage what our staff looks like. I don't have a huge staff. I've got one seasonal employee typically, and then starting to get volunteers, and so they play a big role in weeding, like once a week. If you can get through a prairie of those size once a week hand weeding, that's pretty darn good. Um, if it was a site where I was like, okay, I may only get to spray it in the spring and then not see it to the fall, I think I would spot spray like twice early in the spring and feel pretty confident I can I can overcome that. Um, I've also gotten into a place where I'm chasing blooming species.
Sure.
So there might be like sweet clover, for example. There'll be a huge flush of sweet clover, and I'll have to tell my coworkers like, put your blinders on. We're only going after sweet clover. And so when I'm behind in the season, I'm just chasing flowering plants, flowering weeds to keep them from seeding. If I'm ahead in the season, I'm dealing with them early on then. But yeah, I think in your first 3 years, whatever maintenance you can drum up, that'll pay dividends over the next 10 or 15 years.
Totally. Let's see. If nobody else in the chat has questions, I have one more. Um,
Yeah, and certainly I want to invite everyone down here. Like I think we'll probably put together maybe like a formal chapter thing, but also just want to extend the invite. Like there's a lot of really cool plant people out here. And so yeah, come down and walk our sites and we'll be happy to share with folks.
totally. I think we want to like set up a field trip too. I think Maggie emailed you about that. Maybe I was in on it, but set up a field trip sometime, I don't know, midsummer, late summer.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome. Like June, July. Yeah, that's a great time.
Looks like we have a question.
Okay, I got the chat up too. I can read that. How can I apply some of these techniques in areas I can't flatten and start over? I sprayed invasives for several years. Finally, local natives are coming. I pan seeded some, but could only irrigate small areas. Yeah, it's like I said, it is tricky on different sites. Like I've kind of struggled through a site specific method for here. Interplanting and interseeding are always options. I've got some really large expanses. Say I'm going to do a 20-acre site. Like, there's no way I'm going to be able to handle or put tarps over a 20-acre site, right? And so there there are some things. That's a tough one. If you can't flatten and start over, I think in my restoration, I'm trying to keep brome out completely. Okay. I think in a lot of different areas, if we set the expectation to try to just diversify without removing everything, I think we can still make improvements. So say you were to plant, a lot of native plants into an area that you sprayed that was brome. As it starts to creep back, you may notice the brome or whatever it is start to outcompete those. And I think that's ultimately the downside of not being able to spend the time in your like cleanup phase. But we're experimenting with that too. Like what can we do to just diversify something without having to start completely over? Because, you know, when you just scrape something down to bare bones, you're hurting a lot of the critters in the meantime that were using your non-native stuff. So there are options. It just may not be, you know, something that has as long of a longevity. But I hope that answered your question there. There was a question about this being recorded. I know it was being recorded. Probably connect with Mason or Maggie. Someone will get you hooked up with it, I'm sure, from the Coneup side of things.
Hi, Catherine. Maggie is going to upload the video. I think she said she's going to email it out as like an attachment to this calendar event. All right, I have one more question for you. Do you guys ever do like species richness surveys? And if you do, have you seen any like self recruitment of like other native species?
Yeah, good question. That's not my forte. I'm trying to get our research department to jump in on that a little bit. I can speak more anecdotally of like what I've seen. Um, yeah, there is recruitment. Like whether my director's out there throwing stuff on the ground when I don't see him, or we're drumming up other things. I haven't seen anything radical like in the prairies, for example, but I can give you one example from the riparian restoration. There was a dorky little plant. I think it was cow parsnip.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a plant that there were historical records of it being on our site. Nothing we'd seen, nothing that we seeded. And then like year 4 of that restoration, it showed up. And that was really cool and really encouraging to see like, okay, either the conditions have changed to where that can now like come back to life or it found its way in. Like I don't know how that actually happened, but that's one example of kind of an unknown recruitment of a native that had previously been on our site.
Yeah, that, that's awesome.
But the species richness, I would be so curious about that because I think it changes each year, right? Like
Really?
I'd be for me from a maintenance standpoint, I'd love to know like, okay, that area, that 6 foot swath I beat up with the mower, did that actually become more diversified? At the end of the year, I'm like, oh my gosh, where did I mow what? And so it gets a little bit tricky to track from that standpoint. But I think yes, with a burn, you definitely see it. With the like smaller mosaic mowing, I might have to like flag off areas to like without truly doing like species richness surveys to be able to kind of answer that. But I think yes, it's not been weeds that have showed up, which is exciting. So I think we're at least like suppressing them out, but maybe recruiting some new guys.
Sure. Have you guys? I know you guys have like goats and stuff on out there. Have you guys ever used them to graze any of these plots or?
We have not. I have not. But yes, that is one thing we've been actively working on. Most likely, it's going to be not something we do in house. Probably get a partnership with somebody up in the northern area that they're starting to do these things where they rent out their sheep or whatnot. Yeah, I'm really interested. A little bit nervous about goats for the prairie species. I'm still learning more about how goats chew up seeds. And so
Yeah,
I think for a lot of our noxious weeds or like non-natives, we want them to like chew up and break that seed. But I want to be a little bit cautious about that. But I do think I'm missing animal impact. Like I need that grass. I need all those plants to get processed through like a ruminant animal. And then I want their saliva and their dung, all that stuff. And then I think that will do more than me spraying any fungal compost juice. You get
sure.
like the hoof impact on the ground. Yeah. So TBD, I think that would be like the ultimate thing. And really I think they could be used as a tool to restore with. Like I'm restoring from brome to native plants. I think if I were at bare ground trying to go to native plants, those animals could be like a huge catalyst for that to kind of break that up initially. So yeah, huge opportunity there. But still trying to wrangle it literally.
Totally. Let's see. Oh,
A guy from, gosh, I was giving a tour. I think he was from somewhere in the Midwest. We were talking about that exact thing. And said, I'd like to put a bunch of bison in here. And he said they used to get like 100 volunteers and they trample the prairie.
really?
I just thought that was so funny. But really, I think there's different ways we can do it. So always looking for new things.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Eric, we actually we have both goats and cattle that we graze at the city of Louisville, and yeah, we've been really happy with the cattle results in the prairie. Kind of second what you were saying with the goats, because one thing that we kind of noticed too is the goats can be really intensive with their graze, like going down to very short stubble widths, and also really able to browse understories pretty good. So I think, yeah, I kind of second that a little bit, but yeah, it's been definitely fun for us, and seeing what they can do to the land.
Yeah, that's exciting. I didn't grow up managing animals, and so I've got kind of this theoretical knowledge of animals on the land, but I really think these like high intensity, short duration with long rest periods. Yeah, there's opportunities to use animals in restoration. It's kind of funny because cows forever have been a really big land degrader, um, but there may be an opportunity for them to be involved in restoration certainly. So good to hear y'all are doing that. I'm looking forward to catching up with you more about your project.
Eric, where in New Mexico are you from?
All over. I call Santa Fe home. That's
Okay.
that's
Nice.
where that's where I was. I grew up in the southern part of the state, in a little village of La Luz, and then I moved all over. I've lived in Las Vegas, New Mexico, Portales, Albuquerque. Yeah, so I've kind of bounced around.
I'm from El Paso, so I grew up always going
Okay.
into like Ruidoso area. So
Yeah. Well, see, it's funny. Like I was born in Rio Doso and lived
okay.
in La Luz, Alamogordo. So no, I spent a lot of time through there. Like my wife and I took our honeymoon to the Gila. We got
Yeah.
married in the Oregon. But that's a near and dear place, and it's cool to see some of those plants coming back up north here.
Yeah, totally. No, I love New Mexico. Well, if nobody has any other questions, then I think that's it. Yeah, thanks so much for talking with us. That was awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you. Honestly, if you wouldn't have stopped me that day and chatted, this wouldn't have been possible. So shout out
Yeah.
to you, and good point for all of us to get involved for sure. So yeah, all right. Well, I'll jump off this Zoom, and thanks everybody for attending.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.